Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our next concurrent session on policy initiatives for seniors housing. I am so thrilled to introduce you to our panel of speakers today. They are all superstars in this space from the United States. We have Nancy Berlinger, who's a research scholar at the Hastings Center. We have who's a senior research associate at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. We have Shelley Versey, who's an assistant professor of psychology at Fordham University. So please welcome them all for what I am confident will be a very exciting discussion. I will turn it over to Jennifer, who I think has some slides to share.
So I'll share my slides and Nancy will actually speak first.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone. We're so delighted to be here. This was a really exciting opportunity to have that this arrived via our colleagues Christine Shepard and Tam Perry. And there's a little bit of an echo, so I'm not quite sure how to fix that, but I just hope nobody's distracted by that. So I just wanted to lead off to give a little framework before turning the presentations over to Jen and to Shelley, to tell you that this is the official launch of a 2-year project called Learning from Housing-Focused COVID-19 Response: Actionable Policies and Practices to Support Equitable Aging in Community. We are going to come up with a great acronym or nickname for this project someday, but that's the official title. This is a 2-year collaboration of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University, which is Jen's home institution, and the Hastings Center, which is my home institution. And it's funded by the RRF Foundation for Aging, which some of you may know is the Retirement Research Fund, and that's based in Chicago. It's informed by a transnational Canadian and American research network on housing, aging, and health that Jen and I convened last spring, when we realized that there was one of the many things that was going on in the context of pandemic response was responding to the needs of people who were suddenly finding themselves homebound. We were thinking about the house and the home and the community as a public health space. So we realized that we needed to think beyond ourselves and to say, who were the practitioners, the scholars, the policymakers who could think along with us. So Shelley is one of the members of our network, Christine Shepard, Tam Perry, many other people who you've been hearing from over these 2 days are also part of the network. And so what we're doing here, this project that we have is our first project that aims to identify and elevate promising practices and policy ideas that are coming out of pandemic response, that have potential for long-term equitable advances in housing and in aging in community. So we're taking a population health focus and we're taking a housing focus. And next slide, please. So we have a request for you. We'd like you to share your pandemic gray literature with us, because what we're doing here with our funded study is we're doing a gray literature study. Now, gray literature is a technical term for unindexed literature. It's documents that are not published in academic journals or in commercial publications. So it often includes the way practitioners talk to each other, or talk to communities, or talk to client or resident populations about what they're doing. Newsletters, reports, blog posts, social media posts, and other communications. It may preserve descriptions of problems and solutions that have not been formally studied, and it may include perspectives for people who don't normally write for academic journals. If those of you who are old enough to remember what work was like before there was an internet, it's sort of how you used to information share, where you'd get a newsletter and you'd say, oh, that seems interesting. You'd call somebody up and say, how did you do that? And you'd try it in your own space. So what we're doing here is we're collecting housing-focused gray literature that describes promising practices, by which we mean programs that were devised to meet the needs of older adults in the home setting during pandemic, that may have described a pivot toward housing-focused services or more intensified services, and policy ideas, which we describe as routes to post-pandemic improvement through financing, law, or other policy mechanisms. So we're not saying best practice, because in many cases this work may not have been studied, but these are promising practices that may offer insights for better ways to work and progress on some of the underlying inequities that my colleagues will be talking about. So the areas that we're focusing on middle income, fixed income older adults, and low income older adults in any community setting. So probably less on nursing home settings, but to some extent assisted living and supported independent living. Also people who are living independently or with other family members, focusing on service delivery in the home and housing security, affordability, and accessibility for these populations. So if you have, you want to share examples from the US, Canada, or other aging societies, or if you would like more information, for now you can contact Jen, and eventually we'll have more of a general project mailbox. But for now, Jen will take whatever you need. And with that, that's the end of my spiel. And now I will turn this over to Jen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you so much, Christine, Chalet. It's great to be here with all of you. So I work at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. We are a 60-year-old research center dedicated to advancing understanding of housing issues and informing policy. And one of our core areas of work has become housing and aging. So today, I want to give you a sense of the challenges that we are tracking in a very high-level overview of how U.S. policy is addressing these challenges. So I'll start first with I'll start when I can figure out how to advance my slides. I'll start with a very high level overview of the demographics that we're looking at in the United States. So the oldest baby boomers in the US are now in their mid 70s. And in the next decade, we're really going to see a lot of households in their 80s. That will be the fastest growing age group of all of the age groups in the nation. And as you can see in the far right column, that means almost a doubling of the people 80 and over and the households headed by people 80 and over in the next 20 years. And this also means that the distribution of households in the US is changing. So by 2038, fully 1/3 of households will be headed by someone 65 or over, and 12% of households will be headed by someone 80 or over. And this is really unprecedented. And I think this is where we're going to really start to see great need expanding in terms of living environments that are more supportive of older people with physical challenges who live alone or who have limited incomes to spend on housing and care. Speaking of living alone, right now in the US, about 86% of our households are either one person or a couple. But we know that the chances of living alone increase with age, so that by the time someone is 80 or over, 57% of that population is living alone. And this is a population that is going to double as well. So the share or the number of households of very older adults living alone is really going to be rising in the next 20 years. And again, that's something that we're thinking about. But at the same time, the share of older adults who are living in multi-generational households is also growing. All in all, 20% of older adults, older individuals live in some kind of multi-generational household. And that's where there's an adult from, an adult child or a grandchild or both. And some actually live, with all of those plus their own parents. So we have seen this beginning to rise, and multi-generational households are more common among Black, Hispanic, and Asian households than white families for both historical, cultural reasons as well as economic. And as we see the nation's population growing more diverse in the US, we expect that this trend will continue. So we're really looking at very different needs. The needs of a household that is a single person versus the needs of a household that is multi-generational are obviously very different, but really important for us to consider, as are the care relationships within a family that also affect decisions about where people live. And lastly, something I don't show here, about 3% of people 65 and over in the US live in group quarters, which is mostly nursing homes. Many people are there for short-term rehab stints, but some people, this is providing a vital function for those with significant long-term care needs or end of life. And we know from the pandemic that this is a very vulnerable population. But the share in nursing homes has fallen over the past few decades as we've developed more options to bring care into the community, into the home. Even the number of older adults in nursing homes has dropped even as the population has expanded. So before I get to the challenges we're looking at, I wanted to talk a little bit about housing tenure. Most older US adults are homeowners. In fact, the rate is 80% of those 65 to 79. And then the homeownership rate dips a little bit after that, after age 75 or 79, as people seek lower maintenance and the amenities often found in rental housing. In general, owning confers some benefits that I'll get to on the next slide. And so this is something that Linda Couch spoke about today in her keynote. Owners tend to have more wealth, more stable housing payments. And, even when their incomes fall, their housing payments are generally fixed and they're not going to rise over time as renters will. But as this chart shows, homeownership, for some of the reasons that Linda mentioned today, our historical inequities in our homeownership policy, is not evenly distributed. And since the recession, the black-white homeownership gap among those 65 and over has reached a 30-year high. You can see that in the far right of the slide between the top line and the light blue line. Another point that this chart makes is that the homeownership rate has been falling slightly for older adults in the US, largely fallout from the recession. Those who were 50 to 64 during the recession did not fare as well as people who were past retirement, and younger people have more of a chance to catch up. But this pre-retirement group really kind of suffered a lot, and you can see that in the chart on the right, where we're seeing lower homeownership rates over time for most groups, definitely for white and for Black, and the Hispanic and Asian numbers are bouncing around a bit. But this is a concern going forward as we think about the benefits that homeownership confers. This is one of them, the striking disparities between U.S. owners and renters in terms of wealth and income. And I know that Linda shared a similar slide before. Just as an example, renters 65 and over have a net worth of under $6,000, while homeowners have a net worth of over $340,000, of which $170,000 is home equity. And you can see too that the median incomes are quite different too, almost double for the homeowners. So there's some overarching policy challenges I wanted to get to before I get to the specific challenges of older adult and housing needs. And again, Linda did touch on some of these. The ones I'll be talking about today are gaps in housing affordability, accessibility, supportive services delivered in the home, and age supportive communities. But the overarching challenges that we have in the US include the following. Housing is not an entitlement. We only serve about a third of older adults who are eligible for it, and a quarter of families who are eligible for it. The rest are out of luck. They're on waiting lists. They're not able to get the help they need, even if they qualify for it. The US approach to housing in general and housing an aging population more specifically is fragmented. We have action at the federal, state, and local level, but not a coordinated action. The federal government itself lacks a comprehensive approach to affordable and fair housing in particular. As the Joint Center, my organization, stated in a recent report, the National Housing Act of 1949 set out the goal of a decent home and a suitable living environment for all as soon as possible. And it's been 70 years since this landmark legislation, and the country has not come close to this ideal, at least in part because we lack some kind of coherent national policy. Instead, we've got an amalgam of measures intended to address past priorities and market conditions, and generally created without an overarching goal. And then, of course, we've got considerable differences in state approaches to affordable housing, age-friendly communities, healthcare, and supporting older adults living in the community. Then there's the challenge that Linda also touched on, that housing and health policy are made in two different agencies funded by two different committees in Congress, making coordination really difficult when it comes to something like providing supportive services and affordable housing, which draws on both the health and the housing sides. Since money is limited and programs are fragmented, what we see happening is that nonprofit developers cobble together subsidies from multiple sources. I know of one nonprofit agency that provides housing to low-income older adults in the Boston area that uses over a dozen federal, state, and local sources just to fund the rehab of one of its older buildings that it's doing right now. And lastly, some of the barriers to building more affordable housing are super local and related to zoning and other land use controls, which are mostly controlled at the local level. And it makes it difficult to enact a systemic wide change. So the result is in challenges not just for older adults with low incomes, but we've also got some significant challenges for adults with moderate income households, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So the first challenge I just want to touch on briefly today is housing and affordability. One of the most difficult to address, certainly, especially given the nationwide affordability crisis we have. Housing affordability, it's been said in previous panels, is a function of housing costs and household income. So we use that 30% of your income measure to say whether you are housed or not, or housed affordably or not. And we have about a third of older adults households in the United States that are facing cost burdens, paying more than 30% of their income on housing. About half of those pay more than half of their income on housing. This is an all-time high of older households that are cost burdened. This chart looks at the numbers of older adults who are cost burdened. We break out owners and renters, and we break further out the owners with mortgages and owners without mortgages. By share, 55% of older renters face cost burdens, 40% of owners with mortgages do, and 15% of people who don't even have a mortgage. And they're cost burdened by those expenses like insurance and property taxes and utilities. A couple of trends that are a little bit worrying. More older owners in the US are holding mortgages. In 2019, 42% of owners 65 and over had a mortgage, and the median balance was $86,000. 3 decades ago, that was just 21%, and it had a median balance of $18,000. And those are numbers that are all in 2019 dollars. So that really is a striking difference. And it includes 27% of owners 80 and over, which was up just from 3% 3 decades ago. So this is clearly an issue that we're thinking about. Older adults are also holding other forms of debt. Student loan debt is even up among those in their 50s to 65, the pre-retirement age. And of course, credit card debt and all the rest. So definitely a concern when we think about affordability in the future. The results of cost burden are that there's just less money to spend on other things. And you can see from this chart, we looked at low-income households, comparing the expenditures of those who were paying within 30% of their income for housing and those who are paying more than 30% of their income, or more than 50%, I'm sorry, who are severely cost burdened. So these are all low-income households, but you can see that there's a stark disparity in the expenditures on food, on health, and the people who are still spending, saving for retirement, and on transportation. So meeting the affordability challenge is no easy feat, and it's no easy feat anywhere. As I said before, in the US, housing assistance is not an entitlement. At last count in 2017, we only served a third of those older adults. We have a variety of programs that have been discussed in previous sessions today, low-income housing tax credits to help build, Section 202 to help build and operate supportive housing for older adults, rental assistance programs, a host of block grant programs. But because we were just a patchwork, there's just, and there's just not enough money, we are leaving many, many people out who have needs for affordable housing. We're also leaving a lot of people out in the middle who can't afford housing but don't qualify for these subsidies, which I'll come back to. The second challenge I want to touch on is accessibility within the home. And we all know that disabilities increase with age. This is from a recent tabulation of some census data about the rise of an assortment of disabilities that comes with age. But few homes are accessible to those who have mobility challenges. We tabulated the share of housing units in the US that have 3 features: a no-step entry into the home, wide hallways and doorways that could accommodate a wheelchair or a walker, and single floor living. So there's a bathroom and a kitchen and a bedroom at least on one floor. And we found that 3.5% of our housing stock has those 3 features in combination. That's the last bar part of the chart on the right. When you add in the lever style handles and knobs and accessible electrical controls that you might be able to reach from a wheelchair, it's less than 1% of the nation's housing. Single-family homes are among the least accessible forms of housing. Only 2.8% have those features that are the 3 features I mentioned. Yet this is where most older adults live. Most owners certainly do, about 80% of owners, and nearly 30% of older renters are living in single-family homes as well. So some recent data from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Census has looked at the fit between people and their homes, showing the share of people by age who have difficulty getting to or using various features of their homes. And those 75 and over are in the green bars, and you can really see the sort of dramatic upswing that occurs in the sort of poor fit that a lot of people have with their homes. So there's two approaches I want to touch on to how we are meeting the accessibility challenge in the US. At the policy level, there is a movement where some communities and even the state of Vermont have visitability ordinances, which requires that new homes offer 0-step entry, wide doors and doorways and hallways. They might need to have an accessible entry-level bathroom. The details vary by ordinance, but these are things that are designed to help the future stock become more accessible. So there might be incentives, or these might be mandated, but you know, they're not as widespread as we might like. Not a lot of people necessarily know about them, but they are, where they're active in Pima County, Arizona, in Vermont, they are making a difference. The other way to go about modifying the housing is for the people who live in it right now and have the immediate need, and we know that that can be quite expensive, and so there's a variety of public programs, tax incentives, grants, and low interest loans that are offered by the federal government, state government, local government. You have to know where to look, which is tricky, but these are available to some people. There's nonprofit assistance. Habitat for Humanity, for instance, has some programs. Capable and Comfortably Home offer small grants to help people make their homes more safe and secure and accessible. And then we've got some provisions in insurance where we'll cover modifications, but we know that this is a very limited way to go. So there are some promising policies here, but we have a lot of gaps. The third challenge I want to talk about briefly is ensuring that people have the supports they need where they live. So now moving out of the home and into the neighborhood. More and more older people in the US are concentrating in low density locations. So this chart shows the difference between the 2000 and the 2000 census and the 2017 survey, showing that more and more people are concentrating in those low density areas that are over 65. This isn't necessarily because they're moving there. It's because I think in large part they're aging there, and they've just crossed into the 65 and over group that is growing. And we know that many people would like to stay in their community. So I think this is a fact we have to reckon with. How do we serve people in low density locations where it's not efficient to deliver services necessarily? This chart points out that even renters, this is happening for, this low density kind of movement. So if people are to stay where they are, how supportive are their communities? Do they have housing alternatives besides that single family home? What about transportation beyond one's own car? How do we help older adults in these locations remain engaged, avoid loneliness, get the supports they need? And of course, this doesn't mean that city living is a panacea. If there's transit, it might not serve older adults, might not go where they're going, might not be accessible. But these are all things that I think fall under the realm of age-friendly communities. And we do see this expanding quite rapidly in the United States. Efforts at the community level and at the state level, several states are now age-friendly states. We're really focused on walkability, alternatives to driving, engaging the public, providing services for older adults in the community, access to medical care, all the rest. So it's way more than the built environment, although these pictures really highlight the importance of a welcoming and accessible built environment. The ones on the top being the desirable, obviously, and the ones on the bottom being the things we want to move away from. And that picture of the wheelchair on the crack in the sidewalk was actually taken by a disability rights activist outside of a regional medical center, if you can believe it. So just really important to think about these things too. Another way that we're meeting the location challenges is through villages and NORCs. Villages are membership organizations. The first one was here in Boston in Beacon Hill, that provides services, ways to engage, opportunities for socializing, recreation, but also if you need a contractor, they have a vetted list of contractors. If you need transportation, they have the means to provide some transportation for people in their membership. And these are people living in their own homes, dispersed in the community. A NORC, on the other hand, a naturally occurring retirement community, a place basically where a lot of older people happen to be living or aging. These are often springing up inside of big apartment buildings. Penn South is an example in New York City, where some of the similar kind of services are occurring. People looking out for each other, providing food, providing opportunities for engagement, recreation, and all the rest. And then there's service-enriched housing, which I want to come back to in a few moments. The last challenge I want to talk to you about is the cost of care. So we are increasingly thinking about the combination of housing costs and care costs, the sort of twin burdens of paying for housing and paying for care. And of course, we don't have a great way to estimate the kind of costs of care that we'll need, which I think makes planning quite difficult for people. But just to give a sense of what the median costs are in the United States for a homemaker service, 28 hours a week, a home health aide, the assisted living facility or a nursing home, and then comparing it to renters and owners' income for the year, you can see that it just wipes out the whole income to have to use any of these services. And we do know that most people rely on family, but we also know that there's a caregiver crisis with fewer children to support older adults, and we expect in the future more people will need to rely on paid care. So if income isn't going to do it, what about wealth? And this chart looks at the number of months of care that a renter or an owner could buy at those rates I showed you in the previous chart until they exhaust absolutely all of their wealth. So they're not paying for anything else. They're not paying for any other needs they might have, like modifying their home or what have you. But you can see a typical renter really could survive just a couple of months if they had to pay for those services in their home. The homeowners do better, especially if they exhaust all their housing wealth, which no one wants to do. So just to make the point that this is becoming quite a problem, especially for middle income people who really have no choice. They cannot afford assisted living, but they may not be able to afford to stay in their homes. So meeting the care challenge, some of the programs that we've got going in the United States are helping people stay in their homes and staying well, keeping people out of higher intensity, higher cost levels of care through things like service coordination. The I WISH program, for example, is a federal pilot program that funds a full-time resident wellness director and a part-time wellness nurse in HUD assisted housing that serve older adults. So really keeping people well to help them prolong the time that they are able to live independently and healthily in the home. And then, of course, helping people pay for care. That's a bucket I won't get into, but it involves different insurance programs. But most people don't have long-term care insurance in the United States. It's very expensive and is not an option for most people. So I'm just about to wrap up here. I think there are clearly many domains in which housing and aging intersect when we think about health policy, the built environment, transportation, technology. I want to conclude by bringing this back to the physical house for a moment and argue that to meet all of these challenges that I've talked about, we also need more housing options. We know there's no one size fits all housing for older adults because there is no one type of older adult. We have people living by themselves and living with extended family in urban centers and low density suburbs and rural America. So we need all of these different options. Accessory dwelling units. I think we really need to rethink our housing in the suburbs where most people are aging. How do we create lower cost apartments or some kind of density in a village or a suburban center where you can have some of that walkability and accessibility without having to leave your community? We need flexible housing for multiple generations. Co-housing in some intentional communities offer some options. The service-enriched housing is a really important model where services are delivered in the home, where there may be a service coordinator, and that is becoming a really important thing, especially for low-income households. It's very difficult to do for middle-income households, but there's an organization here in Boston that is trying just that, and they're trying to put a model on the market for middle-income folks who want that kind of life, couldn't afford assisted living. So that's a really promising thing. And then, of course, at higher levels of care, we have some new models as well. Just some pictures. But I will end here. These are some of our reports that you can find on our website. And thank you, everyone, for putting some of the things in the chat that you have to help with our other projects. And I'll turn back to Nancy.
Thank you, Jen. That was wonderful. I've seen versions of this presentation before, and I know it sparks a lot of questions, whether you're based in housing or whether you're based in healthcare. Because for people who are based in healthcare or in social care, this could be a completely different way of looking at some of the challenges you face. Now we have some thank you for people who gave us examples, especially from Canada, of to support our project. And also in the Q&A, there's a number of questions, which I think, since I think we may want to put these questions both to Jen and to Shalay, we should probably go straight to Shalay and then have the Q&A at the end. But they're fantastic questions, and you can upvote or add more questions in the Q&A. Okay, so with that, I will turn the virtual microphone over to Shalay Versi, who is our colleague from Fordham University in New York City. She is a social psychologist, and she does remarkable empirical research at the intersection of housing, aging, health, economics, and really social policy in a particular place. So I'm very, we're sort of seeing that we've seen a lot of the fruits of Jen's quantitative research, and now we're going to see the fruits of Shalay's qualitative research. So take it away.
Thank you, Nancy. I am looking for my slides. Can you guys see them? Not yet. Okay.
I believe someone from tech support was going to show the slides.
That's correct. Michael, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've given him an alert, so maybe we can get the slides up. While we're waiting, we could try some of the questions. How would that be? Okay. So the one that was upvoted the most was, what are some recommendations to help better integrate housing and health services? The big question.
Yeah, just start with the big one.
The interesting thing wasn't, because Jen and I were just talking about this the other day, is that people, when you're situated in housing, might say, how do we do healthcare? And people in healthcare, trust me, say the same thing. And sometimes what happens, as somebody who's based in bioethics and has done a lot of work on healthcare, is that doctors will often put it this way. They'll say, if only I could write my patients a prescription for the housing they need. And it's a wish, and it's a very sincere wish. But sometimes the understanding of the actual housing conditions is not very strong. Now, some hospitals have invested in housing in communities, but it often has to do with thinking about medically fragile populations and discharge planning kind of short term. It's not the kind of solutions that will take people off of waiting lists.
Yeah,
so
I mean, I think at the very highest, most abstract level, we need to continue these conversations between health and housing. I think we are making progress, and when I see our Department of Housing and Health and Human Services and our Department of Housing and Urban Development actually really talking to each other about these things, despite all those difficulties of, silos that we have, I do have some hope. And at the micro level, I do know of developments that are, service-enriched housing, where they're coordinating with a local hospital to provide a clinic in the building that will serve the older adults in that building, but also surrounding residents, where people have the option to go to the doctor right in their building. That's another one I know of that has a gerontologist office and have a weekly visit from a behavioral therapist. I mean, so there really are these options, but as a big policy level, I think we're still working.
So, and I think also one thing that I notice it's housing and health services. So we tend to sometimes go to health care, but the idea of prevention or wellness is another dimension that we aren't always sure who's in charge of. But again, we need to understand each other's vernaculars and each other's financing streams. I think a tech has entered the building, and we have Shelley's presentation. So Shelley, up over to you.
Thanks, Nancy, and thank you to the tech support. Thanks, Jennifer, for a great bird's eye view and an overview. And this is nice. I'm so happy to be here with Christine and Tam and so many people who are knowledgeable about policy and housing. And I'll be picking up where Jen left off, transitioning basically from a very bird's eye view to how some of the specific policies play out in practice. And so the main idea I will be drawing from is not a policy per se, but it's a reflection of older adults' preferences and what Jen referenced as age supportive and also age friendly. In other words, how are we really meeting those changing community needs, not just from a housing perspective, but also extending to neighborhood cities as well. Next, please. Next slide. So just as we can expect more older adults to live alone in single-person households in the coming decades, we can also expect residential migration to slow. So looking at interprovincial and interstate migration generally over the past, let's say 5 to 7 decades, both in Canada and the United States have experienced a similar decline over time and within country migration. So you see the blue line in both countries is the rate of intermigration within each country. And we can see that steadily declining. Next slide. When we look at the trend more closely by age, after the age of 55, the vast majority of Americans stay put. So only about 5% change residencies, and basically fewer than 2% move between states in the US. And in Canada, I believe the trend is the same, that migration is highly selective, right? It's based on economic influence, health, marital status, et cetera, et cetera. And so why talk about mobility in this way? And one of the reasons is that when you ask people, more than 85% of adults over the age of 65 do prefer to stay in their current residence for as long as possible. And we hear a lot about, or some about, retirement migration, but this is usually reserved for adults with more financial resources. So this preference for aging in place has set in motion a number of initiatives focused on preparing the growing number of adults who are staying put in those urban areas in the next couple of years. And also demographic projections suggest that in addition to those low density areas, that a lot of people are staying put in also high density areas. So that has led to the World Health Organization to develop a set of guidelines, but also a global network to better adapt structures, the built environment, and services to meet the needs of older people. Next, please. So this really sounds wonderful. I put this definition here because there are multiple definitions of aging in place, but this is how the Centers for Disease Control here defines it as the ability to live in one's own home and community safely, comfortably, and independently, regardless of age, income, or ability. And again, while defined as the ideal for 3 out of 4 adults, there are several points that we need to consider to really make this a realistic and achievable goal. Next. Great. Next. So we know that aging in place can be less of a choice for some renter, especially low-income renter households, because decisions to move or to stay are closely tied to perceived housing security, affordability, and whether or not affordable housing is accessible. And all of these considerations have led to a second description, a term called stuck in place. Next, please. where people without financial means lack a real choice to leave where they currently are or to stay put. Next. This lack of access to appropriate or desired housing options might mean that things that we typically think we plan for in older age, so where are we going to be, the cost, those social supports, the access to medical care, may seem like a luxury for some lower income homeowners and renters, public housing residents, and those with poor health, because the focus is on the here and now versus the future. And this is also picking up on some of Jen's earlier work about what do we mean when we're talking about aging in place. So I'd like to briefly review some of the results that we've done in New York City as a case study. Next slide, please. New York happens to be an age-friendly city, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this case study and share some of what we're learning as we continue in this conversation about seniors and housing. Really, we wanted to examine in this study how adults living in a global city were experiencing aging in place. And this is particularly important, especially for people who are aging in larger cities, given some of the data that we've heard about housing affordability, which is an increasing concern in many large cities, given the fact that there's already limited housing stock and increasing income inequality through gentrification and other types of large-scale investment. So in New York specifically, we already know this to be an issue, given the table on the right, which shows different types of residential households. And the groups at the highest level of rent burden are single adults. And if you could advance, please. Great. So just, I know this is a little difficult to read, but those adults, that final row are adults who are 60 and older. So our oldest city residents are actually bearing the highest cost burden across the city. Next slide. So the study design here was a qualitative focus group study, including residents from Section 202 housing, as well as senior centers. We recruited 9 sites from Upper Manhattan, which tends to be some of the lower income census tracts in the city. It includes the Central Harlem neighborhood. Some of the inclusion criteria were that participants had to be a resident of the neighborhood for at least 10 years, at least 55 years of age, and able to speak English. Next, please. Because of this, and given the location of the recruitment, which is Harlem, a historically Black neighborhood, all participants identified as African American. Next, please. The mean age was 76, I believe. And it was a mix of men and women. Most were single. If you could advance to the next so I could just see, great. Yeah, most of them were single, widowed, or divorced. The average level of education was high school level, and most of the adults were retired or unemployed. So this was about 100 people that we surveyed over the course of 12 months. Next slide. We would visit, myself and a small research team, get to know some of the residents, and we conducted focus groups. And here were our overarching research questions. We wanted to know the importance of neighborhoods for adults who were aging in place in this particular neighborhood in New York City. We wanted to know how older adults were perceiving change in their neighborhood. And this came out of a previous conversation, a prior study, where we were just and older adults were saying that they wanted to talk about the changes that were happening in their neighborhood. So we already knew that they wanted to talk about change. So we wanted to understand more deeply how they perceive these changes, not they were facilitating or hindering their ability to remain in the community. Here's a picture from one of the sites. It's a senior center in Sugar Hill, the Sugar Hill portion of Harlem. Next slide. Next. So basically, we found these 4 major areas after coding all of our data, and all of them were perceived to be a challenge to aging in place, staying in the city. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of these, but because of time, I'll only share data related to the theme of housing concerns. So when folks would mention that they were concerned about housing in the neighborhood, we would ask them to elaborate, and we were able to distill the responses in these 3 main areas. Next slide, please. These 3 areas, ironically enough, is duplicated. We find the same things duplicated both in Jen's presentation, but also from national studies of older adults like AARP. People desire security, affordability, and the option to live where they want to live and to find available housing there. So if we advance to the first quote, this woman is saying that she feels happy because she found the unit in a Section 202 building. No one's selling drugs there. No one is trying to force open the door. She feels happy and secure. The next participant is remarking on something that we heard across all of the sites. Advance, please. And this was about affordability and the idea that people were either being redirected to other housing options or to shelters. So she's talking about the shelter population being very ridiculous right now. It's like so many people in the shelters. And we're talking about working people. They're not doing drugs on the street. They cannot pay their rent with the money they're asking for rent. Then finally, this issue of availability. Which was also a universal theme across almost all of the sites we visited. This is one of the directors, and it wasn't unusual for some of the directors of the buildings to come and join us for our focus groups. And he says, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm one of the executive directors here at Development and Outreach. And the only way we get a new placement is if somebody dies, and that's unacceptable. We should have enough housing for folks who want to stay. Next slide. The concern about availability was repeated, and I think captured and very perfectly in this exchange. And this was in a different site. Now, I'm sorry, this is going to be a conversation. So if you could just advance every time that I'm sort of pausing, that would help facilitate this. So this is, again, an exchange about availability. So the director is saying that I'm asking her, well, how do people get into the building? She says, well, we give applications, and then everybody that wants to live here sends in their applications. And then obviously there's a waiting list book. It's called The Book. It's literally like a Bible. Then another participant says, or I say, so how long? Say I put in an application, I meet the requirements. Then she says, well, they stay on the list 2 or 3 years probably. Then another participant, and you will get a notification. They'll let you know what your number is on the waiting list. Then another participant, if you know somebody. Then the director, if you qualify. And then the participant. Well, I'm an example of knowing somebody. I applied in November and I moved in January because I knew somebody. And I've known people who put their name in the book here and it gets lost. It's at least 2 to 3 years. That's the way it's supposed to go. And I'm thinking, I don't think this is the way it's supposed to go, but indeed, this is the way that it's being described. Next slide, please. So through a series of conversations, it reaffirmed kind of what the data were telling us, similar to what the large-scale statistics were saying in terms of availability and affordability in New York City, at least. This was also being expressed to us through lower income residents. And even these were residents who were already in Section 202 housing, which means they were rent stabilized or they were subsidized in some way, but they were still expressing to us that either they or someone that they knew were experiencing hardship. Next, please. You can go through the next, I think, 3 clicks. Perfect. So this is just, again, showing that those extremely low income residents are severely rent burdened, and that's indicated by that red bar. And those are the most vulnerable in the city. So we saw that this constellation of factors, lack of affordable housing, habitability, and rent burden led to this overall sense of vulnerability. Next, please. Now, just to give you an idea, this is a map showing all the sites that we recruited in Upper Manhattan. This is the lower part of the Bronx. Oh, you probably can't see my clicker, but anyway, those 1 through 9, those are the sites we recruited. And we wanted to do a study to see if these people were in fact displaced, where would they go in the same neighborhood? And so this next map, if you advance, okay, it's a little hard to see, but you can, the red dots are where would locals be able to afford a unit? And this is based on the area median income, which of course is not a cutoff to which most of our participants could actually qualify for. So this is area median income and how many units within a building would be classified as affordable housing. Red is none, orange is less than half, yellow is more than half, and green is all. So you could just see by the scarcity of the green dots that there would be very few places that older adults could actually move to if they had to move from their current buildings. Next slide. That study laid the foundation for an ongoing study that we're doing, and I just want to share a little bit with you because it's a wonderful nationwide study of women, of tenants and tenant organizers across major cities. We wanted to get a sense of how tenants were experiencing rental pressures across the United States. And because we started last year in the spring of 2020 and we're ongoing, we also inadvertently captured some of the hardships that people are facing due to COVID-19. So now we're up at about 86 tenants and tenant advocates who have shared qualitative interviews with us. Next slide. So this is one of our tenants. Her name is Misha. Please meet Misha. She is a tenant from Dayton, Ohio, who participated in our study. When I told her that I was giving this talk, she asked me to please include snippets of our interview because she wanted to share her story. She was incredibly generous. She actually volunteers with the National Scleroderma Foundation because she lives with scleroderma, which is an autoimmune disease. And she explains how mobility has impacted her search for accessible and affordable housing. So if you could just click on that first little speaker. Is it working? If it's not working, do you think I could share from my end? Let me try. And if not, we can just go on. I'll just try to see if I can play it on my end. 19, I was diagnosed. Can you guys hear that? Okay, I'll rewind it so that we can hear it. Hold up. Diagnosed with scleroderma. And so that's when it kind of started changing for me. I lived in apartments mainly up until that point. After I left out my aunt's house, I started living in apartments. And I've always been the kind of person that pays their rent up front because I didn't want to be homeless. And I knew I didn't have that cushion to fall back on like my parent was. So I just always lived in apartments. The scleroderma caused me not to be able to have children. And so as I got older and I just kept moving from apartment to apartments, basically I stayed, I think about 4 different apartments. But I never left because I wasn't paying rent. It was always I needed to move based on my disability progress and my needs. So I ended up meeting my husband about 10 years ago. He came with a daughter. So he already had a daughter he was getting back from Children's Services. And she was only 6 months. So she was kind of a ready-made family. So I ended up being with him, and we moved into this house because it was
all on one level, and I didn't have to climb stairs. I was able to park my scooter in the backyard, that kind of thing. So it was all based on needs. And they offered us to purchase the house, but they wanted too much. They want too much money, and it's just not that kind of an area to where you would spend that kind of money, for a home. So they wanted way too much. So we just been renting from them, and now we're on a month to month. We've been here that long. Like, they got tired of redoing the lease, I guess, because every year they would redo the lease and then up it by 10%. So every year the rent would go up. And then when the COVID started, they stopped it. So they haven't sent us a new lease. The rent didn't go up, and they kind of just left it where it's at. So that's right now.
So that's Misha. The other two stories describe how she was impacted by COVID, and her husband lost his job, and she was talking about sort of trying to seek out a Section 8 voucher, because before she's paying market rent housing, but they were not eligible for any type of subsidies. So she's saying now she thinks that they might be eligible. And for her, it seems like it's a better situation. And she sort of talks us through the process also of making these modifications to rental housing. Because of time, I'll just sort of move on along, but of course, happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. So ultimately, if we could just move to the next slide, this has been an exercise for me in learning from these stories and these opportunities with tenants, and also, I guess I'm sharing, so, well, maybe not. This has just been an opportunity for me to learn from tenants, and also to return to some of the large scale issues that are framing the conversation that we're having today. Part of what I think became apparent with our conversations early on was that people were thinking about this opportunity as COVID and some of the rescue measures as, could this be an opportunity to build on a re-envisioning of housing policy? Could we use some of the ideas that have worked, things like emergency rental assistance, things like vouchers that we know, for example, here in the United States have been successful in keeping people stably housed? Are there ways to bring, as we were talking about before, the housing people and the public health people together at the same table? So I'll leave it there so we can have time for discussion, but this has been a really great opportunity, and thank you so much for listening.
Shelley, that was terrific. The two presentations were so complimentary. This is one of the richest set of questions I have ever read, and I've moderated a lot of sessions. So I am in the small amount of time available, but I mean, we could write papers just in response to these questions. I'm just going to go to one that came in while Shelley was speaking. And so, because I think in the time available, maybe you could take this one first. If you could ask the government to initiate a housing program targeting seniors, what would it encompass in terms of financing, delivery, intersection with health, income support? What are the comprehensive needs that if we are trying to speak to policymakers, we should try to bring to their attention?
Well, I'll try this one. I mean, I think we do have this habit in the United States of making policy for one housing issue at a time. And it would be lovely to have a program that really tried to do, multiple things at once. And that, in fact, I think sometimes we create problems when we try to solve one problem, we push another problem to, somewhere else. And so for me, if we have as much money as we needed, it would be enough money to build accessible, affordable housing that was well integrated with health, with wellness programs. Another of the questions, I'm just going to take this opportunity to answer that with this one, asked about an example like where there's a senior center incorporated into senior housing, and I I would commend to Brookline, Massachusetts, Coolidge Corner, has two fabulous nonprofit housing providers who support low and middle income older adults, but the Senior Center for the Community is there. They're doing a lot of this. They're the ones who have the doctor in the building. They have a community center. They have ground floor retail opening up to the public. I mean, there's just a lot of ways that this is happening, and it isn't actually happening through one program. It's happening through a lot of dedicated people coming together from different agencies to make it work. So that's kind of my vision of what this would look like. Of course, there's a lot of people who don't want to live in a senior-only housing building, and I respect that too. And that's where it's thinking about how do you get those same services out into the community when people are living, at low densities, and you're worried about isolation and all that. But Shalay, I will turn this to you in my attempt.
No, I agree. I also think that a comprehensive approach is important. And I do think that in combination with other types of policies. So for example, as this housing conversation was happening here in the US, we were also having this conversation about minimum wage, right? So how do you sort of elevate both and at the same time? And I think those types of conversations need to be happening in tandem. The housing and the services. And how do you do that in a way? I mean, the things that I also hear, especially, working with very lower income tenants, is the condition of the housing itself. And so I don't think that just because it's lower income or it is a housing residential building just for lower income older adults, that it has to suffer in any type of way, that there's a way to integrate good care and good habitability into those models.
And I think we're at time. I think we're just over time. So, but unless Christine tells us, maybe we can continue. I'm not quite sure if we're allowed to do that. Christine.
Yeah, hopping on. Yeah, we can stay for a couple more minutes. I think we have time maybe for one more question, and then we'll head back to the main building to just wrap up for the day to set us up for tomorrow.
Fantastic. Well, I think there was a question that was sparked by Shalay's interview data. Isn't truthful community engagement with senior tenants a prerequisite for a positive outcome? That idea of here's the official process and here's how it really works, the sort of workaround. And, any thoughts on that?
Yes, you're saying before anything goes forward to engage tenants in that way. Is that the way?
And also truthfulness about how something really works. If the rules don't match what people's experience of actually getting something is.
I do think that's how it is supposed to work. I think in practice it feels like it doesn't work that way. And I think that these recurring stories about the waiting list and that there's always sort of these other things to be juggling or to try to find out about, things that aren't readily transparent, seems like it's a deterrent to something that should be, like Jen was mentioning before, an entitlement. I mean, why shouldn't housing be needed? So I think that's definitely something that we need to work on and do a better job of.
And these questions are wonderful. I think they might be kind of long answers. So I'm wondering if in the time available, maybe we should wrap this now. Christine, you let me know so we don't end abruptly. But please feel free to be in touch with us. If you have questions, if you have suggestions, I've been madly taking screenshots of these questions because they're fantastic, and they apply to the U.S. as well as to Canada, and they also raise some interesting questions. When we say, for example, housing isn't an entitlement, it raises the question: well, should it be an entitlement? There's no rule that says it's not allowed to be an entitlement, but it does go to our ideas about who is responsible for housing. In New York City, where I live, we have laws about a right to housing, but what it has amounted to during the pandemic is large-scale use of tourist hotels, because we have no tourists at the moment, being used to house people who are unhoused. This is not a sustainable solution. And so there are proposals right now to look at underutilized office space as well as hotels and other things that may not be used for their original purpose, and say, can we solve some of our affordable housing problems? So people are dreaming big right now. Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City, is putting a lot of money into thinking with mayors on these issues. So it's a good time to be bringing up these questions. And so this has been a really wonderful opportunity to be talking with you, even though we can't see you. And we hope the conversation can continue. Thank you. And thank you to Jen and to Chalet.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy and Christine.
Thank you all so much for coming. This has been a fantastic presentation, and I've thoroughly enjoyed listening and learning to all three of you today. Nancy, Chalet, and Jennifer, thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise with us. We will wrap up now and head back to the main room. If Nancy or Michael could send a link in the chat to the main room, I think that would be really helpful. And then we'll just wrap up for the day, and we hope to see you all here tomorrow. Thank you so much.